There's something strange that happens when the media starts speaking in absolutes. Not opinions, not analysis. Certainty. Because the moment you hear people confidently saying a young quarterback can't read defenses, isn't smart, or doesn't belong, you have to stop and ask one question. How do they know that already? We're talking about a tiny sample size, a handful of games, limited reps, and somehow the conclusion is already final. That's not normal. And that's exactly where this situation with Shedeur Sanders starts to feel off. Because while some voices were pushing that narrative hard, one person stepped in and challenged it completely. And when that happened, the reaction wasn't what you'd expect. It got tense, it got uncomfortable. And more importantly, it started exposing things people weren't supposed to notice. Because this might not just be about football anymore. It might be about how narratives get created and who controls them. This whole situation really starts with one thing: the way the narrative was framed. Not questioned, not debated. Declared. Because if you listened closely to what was being said about Shedeur Sanders, it wasn't normal criticism. It was he needs to improve here or he's still developing. It was absolute. Statements like he can't read defenses, that he doesn't study, that he's not smart enough to play at the next level, even suggestions that he doesn't belong in the league at all. That's not analysis anymore. That's a conclusion. And here where it gets strange. All of this is being said based on what? A small sample size, limited reps, a situation where he wasn't even consistently given the same opportunities as others. Yet somehow the verdict is already final. That's a red flag. Because in football, especially at the quarterback position, development takes time. Even top prospects struggle early. Even veterans need reps to adjust. So when someone skips that entire process and jumps straight to a definitive judgment, it makes you wonder. Where is that confidence coming from? Now, to be fair, every player gets criticized. That's part of the game. Film gets broken down, decisions get questioned, performances get evaluated. But there's a difference between critique and dismissal. And what people started noticing here was the tone. It wasn't just negative, it was dismissive, like the decision had already been made and everything else was just justification. That's when fans began pushing back. Because when you hear the same strong claims repeated over and over, especially without clear, consistent evidence, it stops sounding like independent opinions. It starts sounding coordinated. Now, that doesn't mean there's some confirmed agenda. There's no official proof of that. But perception matters. And right now, the perception is that the criticism went way beyond football. Because questioning a player's reads, that's fair. Questioning their preparation, intelligence, and ability to belong at all, that's something else entirely. And once that line gets crossed, the conversation changes. Because now it's not just about performance anymore. It's about how narratives are being built and why they're being pushed so aggressively in the first place. And that's exactly what made the pushback that came next so important. And this is where everything starts to shift, because finally, someone said what a lot of people were already thinking. G. Bush stepped in, and he didn't ease into it. He went straight at the core issue. Not the stats, not the surface-level debate. The certainty. Because that's what stood out the most. The way some media voices were speaking about Shedeur like the case was already closed, like there was nothing left to evaluate, nothing left to develop, nothing left to prove. And G. Bush challenged that directly. He pointed out how strange it sounded, how you can't take such a small sample size and turn it into a definitive judgment about a quarterback's entire future. That's not how the position works, that's not how development works. And more importantly, that's not how real analysis sounds. Because real analysis leaves room. It leaves room for growth, for adjustment, for context. But what was being pushed here? There was no room. And that's what he called out. Now, to be fair, he didn't come in screaming or making it personal. That's what made it hit harder. He stayed calm, direct, focused on the logic behind it all. And when you strip everything down, his point was simple. You can question a player, you can critique their game, that's part of sports. But speaking in absolutes, especially this early, doesn't make sense. And once he said that, the tone of the entire conversation started to change. Because suddenly, it wasn't just about Shedeur anymore. It was about the people talking about him, and whether what they were saying actually held up. That's when things got uncomfortable. Because instead of a normal back and forth, the energy shifted. You could feel it. The pushback wasn't just disagreement, it felt defensive. Almost like the conversation wasn't supposed to go in that direction. Now again, nothing officially confirmed, no one came out and admitted anything. But viewers noticed the shift. And some started wondering, why did that simple point hit such a nerve? Because if the original takes were solid, if the analysis was truly objective, then challenging it shouldn't have been a problem. But the reaction suggested otherwise. And that's when this stopped being just a football discussion and started looking like something much bigger. But what happened next might have been even more revealing than the original criticism itself. Because once G. Bush pushed back, instead of the conversation opening up, something else happened. The defense kicked in. And not from the person being challenged. From everyone else. That's what made it stand out. Because normally, in a real discussion, if someone questions a take, you'd expect a back and forth. Maybe disagreement, maybe clarification, maybe even someone saying, yeah, that might have been too far. But that's not what happened here. Instead, other voices immediately stepped in to protect the original narrative, explaining it, reframing it, softening it, but never actually challenging it. And here where it gets interesting. The person at the center of it, Jason Lloyd, wasn't even there. Yet somehow, his position was being defended like he was in the room. That raised eyebrows. Because now it wasn't just about one opinion anymore. It started to feel like a shared stance. Now, to be fair, this could simply be colleagues backing each other up. That happens all the time in media. People work together, they trust each other, they support each other's takes. But there's a difference between support and protection. And some viewers felt like this crossed that line. Because instead of questioning whether the original statements were too extreme, the focus shifted to justifying them, almost like the goal wasn't to find the truth, but to maintain the narrative. And that's where speculation started to grow. Some fans began asking, is this just coincidence? Or does it point to something more coordinated? Again, nothing confirmed, no proof of any organized effort. But perception matters. And the perception here was that no one wanted to break from the script. No one wanted to say, wait, maybe we went too far. That silence or that alignment can be just as loud as the original statement. Because when multiple voices defend the same take, especially one that's already being questioned, it doesn't just reinforce it. It amplifies it. And at that point, it stops feeling like independent analysis. It starts feeling like a system. And once viewers start seeing it that way, they don't just question the take anymore. They start questioning everyone involved in it. But the biggest red flag didn't come from what was said. It came from who was allowed to say it. Because right in the middle of that discussion, something happened that completely changed how people viewed the entire situation. G. Bush pointed it out himself. The time. He broke it down in real time. One voice spoke for minutes, uninterrupted, unchallenged, allowed to fully explain their position. Everyone listened, no pushback, no cuts. Then it was his turn. And he barely got started. 36 seconds. That's it. Before he was interrupted, cut off, redirected. And that moment hit hard. Because this wasn't just a disagreement anymore. This wasn't just people having different opinions about a quarterback. This felt controlled. Now, to be fair, conversations can get messy, people jump in, timing gets off, interruptions happen naturally, especially in heated debates. But this didn't feel random. Because the contrast was too obvious. One side gets minutes to build their case. The other barely gets a full thought out. And that's what made viewers pause. Because if the goal is real discussion, both sides get space. Both sides get time. That's how you test ideas. That's how you figure out what actually holds up. But when one voice is consistently limited, it raises a different question. Why? Why rush past the one perspective that's challenging everything? Why not let it fully play out? And this is where speculation starts to build. Some fans believe that moment wasn't accidental, that it showed exactly what happens when someone starts breaking away from the narrative, when someone stops repeating the same talking points and starts questioning them instead. Again, nothing officially confirmed. But perception matters. And the perception here was clear. The conversation didn't just feel one-sided, it felt managed. Because every interruption, every redirect, every cutoff moment sends a signal. It tells you what's comfortable and what's not. And in that moment, it became obvious which side made people uncomfortable. Because it wasn't the criticism, it was the pushback. And once viewers saw that imbalance, it changed how they looked at everything that came before it. And this is where the entire story starts to fall apart, because once you look at the so-called competition, it doesn't really look like competition at all. For weeks, there's been this idea floating around that Shedeur Sanders is locked in some intense battle, that there are multiple quarterbacks pushing him, challenging him, possibly even overtaking him. Sounds dramatic, right? But when you actually break it down, it starts to feel manufactured. Because one by one, the names that were being hyped as real competition don't hold up under scrutiny. You hear names thrown around: veterans, prospects, guys with buzz, but when you look closer, most of them aren't even realistic options. Some aren't available, some haven't shown enough, others are just being mentioned to create noise. And that's exactly what G. Bush pointed out. He didn't dance around it. He went down the list and shut it down completely. Name after name gone, not a factor, not a real threat, not someone who's actually in position to take that role. And when you hear it laid out like that, the narrative starts to look shaky. Because if there's no real competition, why is it being pushed so heavily? That's the question people started asking. Now, to be fair, every team explores options, every roster has discussions. Media will always speculate about potential moves, possible additions, different scenarios. That's part of the business. But there's a difference between exploring possibilities and creating the illusion of a crowded race. And some fans believe that's what's happening here. That the idea of competition is being amplified to make the situation seem more uncertain than it actually is, to keep the conversation going, to create tension where there might not be any. Again, nothing officially confirmed. But when you hear multiple names constantly recycled, hyped up, then quietly dropped, it starts to feel less like analysis and more like a pattern. A cycle. Build someone up, compare them, create doubt, then move on to the next name. And through all of that, the focus shifts away from what's actually happening on the field. Because instead of evaluating real performance, the conversation becomes about hypothetical scenarios. Maybe this guy, what about that guy, could someone else step in? And the more that cycle continues, the less clear the reality becomes. Until someone finally steps in and says, there is no real competition. And once that's said out loud, it forces everyone to look at the narrative differently. But this is where the story takes an even sharper turn, because now it's not just about media narratives anymore. It's about what actually happened behind the scenes. Because when you look at how Shedeur Sanders was handled during that stretch, some of the decisions don't fully add up. And people noticed. One of the biggest questions revolves around reps, specifically why he wasn't consistently getting time with the main group. In a situation that was being labeled as an open competition, you'd expect rotation, you'd expect opportunities, you'd expect a fair look at what each quarterback can do. But that's not what it looked like. Instead, there were moments where Shedeur was reportedly working separately, different field, different reps, limited chances to run with the starters. And that's where the confusion starts. Because if a player isn't getting equal opportunities, how do you fairly evaluate them? Now, to be fair, there could be explanations. Sometimes coaching staffs structure practices differently. Sometimes reps are distributed based on system familiarity, timing, or even long-term planning. Reports suggest there may have been factors related to learning curves or playbook adjustments. That's part of the process. But here's the issue. When those same limited reps are later used as evidence against a player, it creates a contradiction. Because now the narrative becomes, he didn't show enough. But if the opportunity wasn't fully there to begin with, how much weight does that evaluation really carry? And that's the question people started asking. Because from the outside, it begins to look less like a fair competition and more like a controlled situation. One where certain players are given more visibility, more chances, more room to succeed, while others are left trying to prove themselves in smaller windows. Again, nothing officially confirmed as intentional. But perception matters. And the perception here is that the setup didn't match the message. You can't call something open while limiting who gets to actually compete. And once that disconnect becomes visible, it starts to explain a lot of what followed. Because now, when media narratives come out questioning readiness or development, fans start connecting the dots. Was it really about performance? Or was it about opportunity? Because if the foundation wasn't level from the start, then everything built on top of it becomes harder to trust. And that realization changes how the entire situation is viewed. And this is where everything connects, because once you zoom out, this doesn't look like an isolated situation anymore. It starts to look like a pattern. Because this isn't the first time we've seen this cycle play out. A quarterback gets hyped, pushed into the spotlight, talked about like the next big thing. Every headline, every segment, every discussion builds them up. Then suddenly it flips. The same player gets questioned, doubts start creeping in, narratives shift, and just like that, the spotlight moves on to someone else. We've seen it happen over and over again. Different names, same script. And that's what makes this situation with Shedeur Sanders feel familiar to a lot of fans. Because while other quarterbacks are getting that temporary boost, being labeled as the future, the answer, the guy, Shedeur seems to be on the opposite end of that cycle. Instead of being built up, he's being broken down early. And that raises a bigger question. Why? Now, to be fair, media coverage always involves trends. Players get hot, conversations shift, new names generate interest. That's part of how the sports world operates. But when the pattern becomes predictable, people start paying closer attention. Because it stops feeling organic. It starts feeling controlled. Some fans believe this is less about performance and more about narrative rotation, keeping the conversation moving, keeping debates alive, creating constant engagement by switching focus from one player to another. Again, that's speculation, but it's a conversation that's growing. Because when you see players go from next big thing to question mark almost overnight, and then watch that same cycle repeat with someone new, it becomes harder to ignore. And in the middle of all that, you have a player like Shedeur who doesn't neatly fit into that cycle. He's not being introduced as a surprise, he's not being gradually built up. He's already carrying expectations, and instead of being developed through the narrative, he's being challenged by it. And that creates tension. Because now the story doesn't follow the usual script. It doesn't build. It clashes. And when that happens, the coverage starts to feel different. Sharper, more aggressive, less patient. Which is exactly what people are starting to notice here. Because if this really is part of a larger pattern, then this situation isn't just about one player. It's about how stories are created and who decides how they're told. And when you step back and look at everything together, this stops feeling like a simple disagreement. It starts feeling like a turning point. Because this was never just about one take or one player or even one debate on a show. It's about how quickly a narrative can be created and how hard it is to challenge once it starts spreading. You had a young quarterback being labeled in absolute terms, not developing, not inconsistent, but already defined, already judged, already placed into a box that usually takes years to build. And that alone raised questions. But then came the pushback. One voice stepping in and saying, "This doesn't add up." And instead of the conversation opening up, it tightened. The defense came in, the interruptions followed, the time imbalance became obvious, and suddenly what should have been a normal football discussion started to feel controlled. That's when people really started paying attention. Because once you notice those patterns, the certainty, the alignment, the lack of real back and forth, it changes how you hear everything else. Now, to be fair, none of this proves anything definitive. There's no confirmed agenda, no official statement that explains it all. But perception matters. And right now, the perception is that something about this situation doesn't sit right. Because when analysis turns into conclusions too early, when criticism turns into dismissal, and when pushback gets limited instead of explored, it creates doubt. Not just about the player being discussed, but about the people doing the discussing. And that's the bigger takeaway here. Because this isn't just about whether Shedeur Sanders will succeed or not. That answer will come with time, reps, and real opportunities on the field. This is about how the story around him is being shaped before that even happens. And whether that story is being built on honest evaluation or something else entirely. Because at the end of the day, fans can accept criticism. They can accept debate. What they don't accept is when the outcome feels decided before the process even plays out. And now the question isn't just about Shedeur anymore. It's about the narrative itself. Who's controlling it and how long people are going to believe it.